Good afternoon and welcome to our audience viewing from across the country and to our distinguished guests who we'll introduce to you very shortly. This is the first in a series of 6 conversations on the future of public safety, hosted by John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE. My name is James Cadogan, and I'm privileged to be the moderator for this conversation and for the series upcoming. And these are going to be expert conversations that try to attack where are we now in this moment of reawakening on racial justice and policing practices. How do we get to a new future of public safety? And given the moment and given what we're talking about, there are no organizations better positioned to host this kind of conversation than John Jay and NOBLE, both steeped in the Black community and dedicated to serving law enforcement officers, particularly law enforcement officers of color. And through these dialogues, we are looking not just to diagnose what is happening today or what's happening in policing, because many experts and academics and thinkers and practitioners have done that over time. We're really trying to dig into where we go from here to determine a practical path forward with the expert voices, opinions, and ideas of our guests. I'm looking forward to exploring all of those with you. But first, I'd like to introduce a leader who has been steeped in justice practice for her entire career, the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Karol Mason.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today in this important conversation on the future of public safety. I want to start by acknowledging how painful and difficult this year has been for all of us. In the midst of a global health pandemic, we find ourselves in the middle of a national reckoning on racial justice in America. It's my belief that John Jay College and the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives are uniquely positioned to lead the country through this crisis and to reimagine public safety and the role of policing. John Jay College was established with the understanding that if we educate our future law enforcement officers with a strong liberal arts foundation, those officers would then go on to be better partners with the communities they serve. As the leading institution in this country for educating police officers, the majority of whom are now students of color, we know that most law enforcement officers do their jobs right and well. And just as we're educating fierce advocates for justice who put on a uniform, we're also educating the activists and community leaders who are the next generation of champions for peace and safety, those who will both work with our public servants and hold them accountable when justice demands it. As the first woman of color, a Black woman, leading John Jay, I personally feel the weight of this national reckoning with race, and I also see the tremendous opportunity that this role presents. At John Jay, we have been examining how we should be educating our future leaders, educators, public servants, and law enforcement officers to prepare to create a world where we no longer suffer tragedies like what happened in Minneapolis and Kenosha or Louisville. Our Black Student Union took the lead in beginning these conversations in early June and brought together powerful voices, including our own John Jay faculty scholars, Chief Chuck Ramsey, and strong advocate voices. And we followed up with a forum at the end of August, again engaging the voices of police leaders like our alum, First Deputy Commissioner of the NYPD, Ben Tucker, our own strong academic voices, and the voices of advocates, all preparing us for this series of conversations that we are kicking off today. Two of the many things that resonated with me from these conversations are that we can find common ground when we make a commitment to engage in conversation and to stay in dialogue across perspectives. Secondly, that John Jay, along with NOBLE, is poised to lead the country through these difficult conversations because of who we are. Our goal is to lead our country to a place where communities of color and police trust each other and partner with each other in building communities where everyone feels safe and has the opportunity to thrive. I am so glad that you're joining in these conversations, and I'm so eager to get to work together to create a bold new vision for public safety in America. Thank you.
For the other co-host of this event, the Chief of Durham Police and the immediate past president of Noble, Chief CJ Davis.
Hello, I'm CJ Davis, Chief of Police for the City of Durham, North Carolina, and immediate past president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, Noble. I started my career in law enforcement in the city of Atlanta, home of the civil rights movement, where I served for 30 years before retiring there in 2016 to become Chief of Police here in Durham. My years of experience as a police professional were preceded by other contributing factors about who I am as a person. You see, I was the fourth of 6 children, born in a military family, where we also learned early on about our Black history in America, the generational injustices experienced by people of color, and the plight still felt because of systemic racism. To prepare us for the world, my parents equipped us with values that carried us through racially charged climates, values such as faith, trust, love, respect for others, and service towards a higher and nobler cause. I know that my childhood experiences influenced my decisions as an adult to become a public servant, a leader, and a chief. In this moment in our history, as we witness one controversial police encounter after another, we ask ourselves, what has happened to cause such division and chaos in our industry? A profession that should represent the best of who we are expected to be, guardians of nobility, integrity, and honor. While most police officers serve with dignity and honor every day, we know that building trust and charting a clear path towards police reform will be a daunting task. That's why I am so very excited to be a part of this unique opportunity as Noble and John Jay College of Criminal Justice create a platform to discuss with you in a series of conversations to reimagine policing in 21st century America. Undoubtedly, the need for change is clear. Where we go from here begins with each and every one of us joining together as we discuss policy recommendations and how we rebuild trust in marginalized communities who are disproportionately impacted by law enforcement. Thank you for your active engagement and support as Noble and John Jay College of Criminal Justice Future of Public Safety conversations begin. We are certain that with your help, we can answer critical questions to ensure a better and brighter future for all Americans.
And thanks so much for that, Chief Davis. And now I want to introduce to everybody our distinguished guests for this afternoon and for this conversation, who will all be framing up our issues that we want to work through during the course of the next month as we dig into different subtopics in our debate on policing and our debate on racial justice. First, we have Commissioner Danielle Outlaw from the Philadelphia Police Department. Welcome, Commissioner Outlaw.
Thank you.
Next up, we have DeAnna Hoskins, who is the CEO and founder of JustLeadershipUSA.
Thank you, Jay.
Welcome. We have Chief Medaria Arradondo from the Minneapolis Police Department.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to see you, Chief. we have Mr. Wes Moore, who is the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation.
Thanks so much. Great to be here with you.
Good to see you. We have Mr. Sean Smoot, who's the director of the Police Benevolent and Protective Association.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with all of you today.
Welcome. We have Ms. Erica Ford, the CEO and founder of Life Camp. How are you? And finally, we have Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, the 60th mayor of the city of Atlanta. And Ms. Bottoms will be joining us a little bit later with her video. Thank you. So I want to dive right into the conversation with our panelists and really dig into two of the things that President Mason and Chief Davis just said. Number one is dialogue across difference, and the other is rebuilding trust. And even before we get into those, one of the things that I think we want to do, especially with such a powerhouse set of guests and experts, is define what do we actually mean by public safety. We can't get to the future of public safety unless we all talk about what we mean. And as we've seen over the course of the past many months, and frankly, the past many years, depending on who you talk to, public safety is defined differently. So I'm going to tee this up for our panelists and start with Commissioner Outlaw, then come to Mr. Moore and Mr. Smoot. When we think about public safety in your particular roles, what do you want the public advocates and legislators to think of? What do you want to cue in their minds when they hear the term public safety?
Thank you for that question. I think the first thing is a recognition that public safety goes beyond police and fire. Traditionally, when we think of public safety, we think of the firefighter or anyone, right, who responds to 911, to include police officers. But now the community's expectations and needs have evolved so much, and that we find ourselves, because we're pretty much along with fire and EMS, we're the sole entities that are available to respond and actually pick up a phone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But we're finding that the types of calls that we're responding to don't necessarily require law enforcement because there's no crimes committed. And because of the fact, whenever there's an automatic police presence, what I've been saying is it automatically criminalizes whatever that matter is. So if we're dealing with someone in crisis, or we're talking about those who are unsheltered, whatever that is, because folks can pick up a phone and call and they know we'll answer and respond, we're the ones that have been responsible for all things what has been deemed public safety. So what we would need legislators to understand is that this evolves well beyond us. There are policy matters that are involved here. Of course, that's where our legislators come in. There's a role for our social service partners. And when we talk about the need to really communicate and collaborate with our community, we really need to have some serious conversations about how we engage with our community and involve them into our everyday processes. So again, it's an understanding, a shared understanding that everyone has a stake, everyone has a role to play, and we have clear lines of responsibilities of who's responsible for what. So that way, we are not unintentionally criminalizing matters that aren't necessarily police matters.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Commissioner. Everyone has a stake. Everyone has a role to play. I think we're going to find that as a theme, and I think that's a great way to kick us off. Let me come to Wes Moore. Mr. Moore.
Thank you so much. And first, I just want to say it's a real pleasure to be with all of you and people who not just do tremendous work, but I admire the commitment and the work that all of you do. When I think about public safety, I just want to echo something that Commissioner Outlaw said, is that the definition of public safety hasn't changed. The definition of public safety and what we want in our communities is the same definition for public safety that we have had throughout. It's a sense of freedom. It's a sense of autonomy. It's a sense that you have a community that believes in your dreams and aspirations and your personal safety, but also your future safety with the same level of support that you should have for yourselves. And so I think when we're having this conversation about policing, we have to, it's important to frame it up that policing is a tool of that. It's not the only tool of that. Our police force is a tool of that to be able to support that level of autonomy and freedom and comfort that people should feel. It's not the only tool that needs to be utilized when we're talking about making sure that everybody in our communities feel safe. I mean, I run one of the largest poverty fighting organizations in the country in Robin Hood, and I've been working on these issues for much of my adult life. And the reality is that when we're talking about what we are looking for in our communities, what our community members are asking for, fighting for, advocating for, is that every single unit that is there to enforce this idea of public safety, every single unit that's there to be able to provide that pathway of public safety, that they actually have the same mission. And that same fundamental mission is to enforce what we've always considered when we talk about public safety, is this idea that everyone should feel a sense of comfort in their own neighborhoods and in their own homes. Everyone should feel a sense of comfort in their own skin. Everyone should feel that the entire neighborhood is there to lift up their dreams and aspirations. And everyone should feel that all of these forces, all of these units, all of these mechanisms, all of these tools, much of which are being paid for by the people in the community, that they are there to be able to support those same measures and dreams. So the idea of public safety is something that the police department has an important role to play in. But it's also important to frame it out that they are one of many tools whose job it is to make sure that we're protecting the futures for all of our citizens.
I love that. Thank you so much, Wes. The idea of mission alignment, there's safety for comfort, for supporting people's individual dreams and freedoms is a wonderful way of capturing the spirit of public safety. Let me add into the conversation, Sean Smoot. Mr. Smoot, are you there?
I am.
Wonderful.
So I totally agree with both of them. I think that public safety includes access, people feeling that they have access and that access is equitable and equal to spaces and services, that people feel safe going about their life activities. And, I kind of think of the definition of public safety as something that's defined by the community. And what I've heard doing work around the country over the past several years is that what people really want is, and I think this is everybody, regardless of where they live, who they love, or what they look like, they'd like to be able to let their kids play in the front yard or in the park across the street and not have concern or worry, and be able to go about the business of their life without having concern or worry about not only being a victim of crime, but also of being a victim of some kind of a disparate treatment. And I think that's, unless we get to a place where everyone, regardless of where they live, who they love, and what they look like, has that feeling of security, we don't really have public safety.
That's incredibly helpful. And the notion of public safety being defined by community and respecting the autonomy and agency of people and having self-determination and being able to chart their own course for their lives is so important here. And that actually bleeds into the next question, where I want to get some perspective from Erica Ford and also DeAnna Hoskins, if we can, on when we think about community voices and we think about those definitions of public safety that we just heard. What does a safe community look like today? In addition to critically eliminating officer-involved shootings and fatalities, particularly for Black and Brown communities, but going beyond that, what are we really talking about when we talk about safe communities? How do we encapsulate that and inject that into our conversation? I think, DeAnna, you may be frozen. Erica, you want to kick us off?
I can go while Erica.
Perfect. You're back, DeAnna. Please.
Yes. So one of the things when we talk about from a community perspective, I really appreciate Wes and the commissioner and Sean. And I think Wes says something very instrumental, that entities of policing and different things are tools. And it takes a variety of those tools. And we've been addressing those tools individually and not collectively, right? We've been focused on policing and how police respond without actually talking about the policies, not actually talking about the food deserts and the intergenerational poverty that happens in communities. And then what is safety for everyone? A lot of times when we talk about safety and people define it, they're looking from an aspect of being safe in a manner of a certain population, maybe intimidating to them. But that population as well has the right to feel safe, that when law enforcement does show up, I think the commissioner said, when law enforcement shows up, it automatically criminalizes whatever the interaction is, whatever the act. And from a community perspective, our voices have to be heard. Sean talked about the community wants to be heard and what their needs are, but also the community has to be a part of those conversations. For so long, Black and brown communities have been spoken to, things have been done to us, and not engaging us in those conversations. And that's why we really push on being at the table when those decisions are made, being at the table when policies are being made, being at the table when we talk about what are the poverty reduction programs and things that are going to be implemented, making sure they meet the needs of the individuals that are actually in that community and not what the presumption of people who don't live in those communities are. Erica focuses on gun violence. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Erica and her project is they don't do what the book says we should do. It's very non-traditional, engaging with a population that has a high propensity to commit a violent crime or actually be the victim of a violent crime that actually has to take place. But when we look at those non-traditional services, those non-traditional interactions that haven't been done before, what we're finding out, they're just meeting individuals' basic needs. They're addressing some of the traumatic experiences that no one has paid attention to. Let's be honest, growing up in impoverished areas, in food desert, with lack of resources, lack of adequate education, adequate housing, is a traumatic experience. And if you add incarceration on top of that, which is a traumatic experience within itself, we never address the fundamental needs of a population we have identified who we're trying to be safe from. So I really appreciate Wes, the commissioner, and Sean talking about this from a holistic perspective and not individualizing it, which will continue to criminalize a certain population, a segment of population. And I'll turn it over to Erica.
Thanks so much, DeAnna. That's absolutely fantastic. The two things that I really take away from it is the trauma of poverty and the trauma of incarceration. The compounding effect of those two things are something we have to target head on. And I really appreciate the way that you just threaded those together. Erica, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Please,
the trauma of Zooms. But when you look at our community and you talk about public safety, the entire community does not have the access to the quality of life that makes them feel safe. Whether it's not having the access to food, whether it's not having the access to proper education and care for your children, and not being able as a man to take care of your family, those things do not allow you to feel safe. And then you go out and you do things and you create acts, or you are exposed to acts that further traumatize you and your community. And so when we talk about the generational trauma that exists in our communities due to the poverty, due to the lack of quality, everything across the board, we don't have public safety. Because when we go into the public, we take the trauma in which we experience on a day-to-day basis into our daily paths. And so when we encounter those who are there to protect our community from another perspective, it is always met with a sense of fear. And so therefore we are engaged in confrontation as opposed to safety. And it further escalates the trauma, and then the cycle begins, as the sister that everyone else talked about before me. And so when we look at it in New York, we look at how we help people heal from the disease of violence, right? And so you're looking at everything that feeds into that individual that can remove them from the interaction or healing from the trauma that they've been exposed to, from the different things that happen on our generational journey called life, right? And so in order to get true public safety, we have to heal. We have to build the resources in our community and then have access to quality of life once again, or for the first time.
Thank you so much, Erica. Breaking that cycle, that's a critical piece of this puzzle. And one of the things that you said sparks my next question in terms of bringing trauma with you to a moment of first response by law enforcement and thinking about what productive community engagement looks like. I want to get, I believe Mayor Bottoms has joined us. If he has, I'd love to go to pose the question to her. Mayor Bottoms, how are you, ma'am?
I'm good. It's nice to join you.
Thanks so much for being here. One of the things that we just heard from Erica and DeAnna is thinking about the trauma of poverty, the trauma of incarceration, how those two things collide. And when public safety is added to that equation, we're trying to get from one to another. We don't naturally get from trauma to safety. And we're trying to break this apart so we can start talking about what's a productive path forward. Absolutely in breaking that cycle, but getting to real community engagement where community voices are incorporated into the process of building that public safety collaboratively with our elected officials. So you as Mayor of Atlanta have firsthand experience with this. Would love to get your perspective on how we start building collectively towards a new public safety that incorporates community voices.
Well, thank you for having me. And unfortunately, I didn't hear the first part of the conversation, but I'll just jump right in. My father was incarcerated, so I know what that trauma is like on families, and I know how traumatic that experience can be, especially for children, because I watched my father get taken away in handcuffs, and I spent many weekends, more than I care to count, visiting him in prisons across Georgia. And what I saw was that there were men who looked just like my dad and children just like me, going in and out of these prisons, which is very traumatic for any child. So needless to say, for me growing up, there was this inherent distrust in public safety because I didn't understand all of the dynamics of my father's incarceration. I just knew that some men came, arrested him, traumatized my brother and sister and I in the process, and it broke our family up. That being said, as an adult, what I now understand is there's so much more to it than that. And I think a big part of the conversation, one that we're not having enough, is really about our mental and emotional health and stability and how we deal with this post-traumatic stress that children and families often endure in our communities. In Atlanta, prior to the summer, you couldn't have told me that we weren't by and large getting it right. But what we saw happen in real time in Atlanta is that our problems are just as real as in any other city. And although Atlanta is known really as this mecca for African Americans, certainly our challenges are still the same, and we're not immune from many of the challenges that we're seeing happening across the country. So I think a part of it is having this discussion on mental and emotional health, but also holding everyone accountable. Something we were doing in Atlanta that has had a really good impact on many of our communities was taking this proactive approach to public safety and interactions with our communities. So on the west side of Atlanta, which is one of our most challenged neighborhoods, communities, but one of our most historic communities. It's where my family took root in Atlanta over 100 years ago. We have the Police Foundation has a place in the community that kids can go to as a community center Our recruits, our police recruits are volunteering in the community. With the assistance of the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, our officers are able to live in the community and create this sense of partnership in a way that we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So the first interaction with our officers is not when they're picking up kids, taking them off to jail, or when they're coming in, taking their parents away in handcuffs, is what I experienced. But their first interaction is a positive interaction. And to the extent that it's not a positive interaction, this is a safe place that families can get the wraparound services that they need, whether it be GED training, access to social and emotional services, access to housing information, et cetera. I think that's the model that we have to replicate, not only in Atlanta, but I think if we replicate it across the country, we'll see better outcomes and better trust between our communities and our public safety officers.
That's incredibly helpful, Mayor Bottoms. In particular, thinking about those wraparound services, thinking about mental and emotional health, that gets us back to a point that the Commissioner Outlaw made at the beginning, that the police are first responders for a whole range of problems and challenges that a police department simply can't handle by themselves. So looking at the ecosystem of how we support communities is part of what we really want to dig into and think practically about. If I can get Chief Arradondo in here, I'd love to get his perspective, because I know he spent a lot of time thinking in Minneapolis about how to do this work with communities and work effectively. Chief, could you comment on Mayor Bottoms as she's taken it in this direction of thinking about mental and emotional health and what police can do, or what we think police need in order to be able to appropriately engage communities and build as part of a holistic set of approaches that will support community needs?
Yeah, thank you. The Honorable Mayor Bottoms, I think, really touched on this, is that, and also Commissioner Outlaw, that we have to think holistically. We can no longer be the savior for all of our communities. We're really looking at, I think, police departments that have done it smartly over the past several years have really looked at the role that from a public health lens, how much that lends itself to the work that we are doing. We know that hurt people hurt people. We know that trauma exists, and I know that my wonderful sister, who's been in the struggle for so many years of really helping our communities, Sister Ford, has really preached this so often that we have to address the trauma that exists out there. Police departments themselves are not going to be able to do that. We have to look at all of these types of different social dynamics that are at play. If you would have told me even a couple of years ago that I would be really preaching everywhere I go about the role that when people do not have shelter, when people do not have adequate housing, how that plays into community safety. I'm a huge proponent of how that absolutely plays a big part into community safety. And so I think that we have to be, certainly in policing, I think we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. I think we have to expand our allyship and work across the board. I also think, for the Honorable Mayor Bottoms, I think it takes police leaders to make sure that we're having these very candid conversations with our mayors. If we're talking about our budgets tell our story. It's not only saying, that we need the computers and the squad cars and those things, but it's also at telling our mayors that, you know what, Mayor, we don't do this role, or we don't serve in this role the best. Some of the funding that I have in my budget, as tough as it may be, I think we need to shift that. I think that Life Camp, Sister Ford could do a better job in healing and helping our communities better than we can. And so it's really going to take us looking at things from a different lens, being very courageous and vulnerable at the same time. But I absolutely agree with the Honorable Mayor Bottoms that we have to be different in how we think, and we have to look at it from a different lens as we move forward.
That's fantastic, Chief. I want to bring Erica in, because I think she wants to build on this point and respond to some of what you said, Chief, which is really important.
Yes, definitely. When we look at what just happened to us, right? We looked at the role of the coronavirus, right? It killed and traumatized a lot of the community. Then we looked at the killing of George Floyd, and the uprise around the nation. And those two things mixed together with the unemployment, with releasing folks from incarceration without giving them the resources that they need to be whole people, putting them in communities where they couldn't even go to their families. We said to the mayor, we said to the philanthropy, we said to anyone that would listen that this is the remedy for disaster, and that we had to work together with philanthropy, with community, with police to shift how we are looking at dealing with this trauma, right? Because everybody was traumatized, confused, and now we know that he lied and people died, right? And so what happened? More violence happened around the nation on top of the violence happening with police, right? And so we had to go in and not only mediate situations between individuals, but mediate situations between police. And without having that trust with police, we would not have been able to reduce the number of incidents that have happened in New York City, even though you see a lot of incidents. And so where the New York City crisis management system was, we were able to mediate situations. And one situation example, on the 4th of July weekend, because we also saw an influx of fireworks in all of our communities, and all of these things lead to the sense of fear that was trying to be built across the nation. And I say all of these things because as we sometimes get the boogeyman put into our minds and we hear the word defund, and so people automatically run, no, we can't do that. But it's all we're talking about is investing in what is the broken piece of the puzzle. And the broken piece of the puzzle is the people on the ground. And so on the 4th of July weekend, when the police were being attacked by young people with fireworks, we were able to say to the police inspector, move the police out of here, allow us to take care of the young people. Your police will not be onslaughted by them. And without that respect, they wouldn't have removed the police, but they removed the police. We were able to deal with the young people. And in our particular area that we were in charge of, no shootings, no incidents happened that weekend. And again, on Labor Day weekend, we went to work, we deployed men and women throughout the community, and we were able to negotiate peace. We were able to, give people incentives to stay in the house. We were able to interrupt situations and help alleviate some of the work that NYPD would have normally had to have done, and also go straight to where we know the problem will come from. And so that is why it has to be a co-producing type of situation, and more resources have to be shifted from the criminalization to helping people heal and provide those wraparound services that the mayor talked about that people so desperately need in this day and time.
That's a perfectly put point. The co-production of public safety, which you don't hear much about that in the national dialogue, but certainly it started to percolate and trickle up. And I would love to hear more about that, because it really captures what we mean when we're talking about collaboration amongst the different elements of community to serve community residents. On that point, Eric, I'm going to bring in Wes, because I think he has will be able to comment on just what you were talking about with respect to the importance of looking at poverty and how poverty helps fuel community violence, and how poverty helps fuel mistrust of police.
Absolutely. And first, to what Eric is saying, amen. Because the reality is that when people talk about things like there's a school to prison pipeline, there's not. There's a poverty to prison pipeline, because not all schools have a pipeline to prison. We're talking about communities that oftentimes we're talking about impoverished communities and families that are living in impoverished situations, right? Because the reality is where that people don't need to be reminded about what poverty looks like or how poverty feels, because they're reminded every day. They're reminded by the water they are drinking. They're reminded by the air they are breathing. They're reminded by the homes they are living in. They're reminded by the neighborhoods in which they exist in. And yes, they're reminded by how they are policed, because they're policed differently. The reality is that when we're talking about, and so we have to be able to address the issue of poverty in all of this, because that is what is fueling. That is what fuels the criminal justice system. That is what fuels everything from the need for policing reform. That is what fuels the need for reentry reform. It's poverty. And it's the fact that we are hyper criminalizing poverty. And it's about the fact that when you have a person who was born into poverty, their probability and their chances of being able to make it out of poverty are remarkably slim. And it's a much bigger portion of the population than people think. In New York City alone, this is pre-COVID, half of the population lived in poverty for at least a year for the past 4 years. That's research we did with Columbia University, over Robin did with Columbia University. Half of New York City, not half of a borough, not half of a demographic, half of the city lived in poverty for at least a year over the past 4 years. So we're talking about a significant portion of our population that we know have very different pathways than others. And I think about it in context when how we're talking about we need to be able to address the issue of poverty, but frankly, we also need to be able to address the issue of policing accountability and laws. Because I think about the case of my hometown in Baltimore, and I think about what happened in Baltimore 5 years ago. And in many ways, there's so many shades. As you're looking with the commission in Minneapolis, you saw so many shades of exactly what we saw there in Baltimore 5 years ago, with the death of Freddie Gray. And the thing that initially triggered the interaction between Freddie Gray and law enforcement was that he made eye contact and he ran. The reason why that's important is because that only triggers probable cause in certain neighborhoods. It triggers probable cause in oftentimes high poverty / high crime areas. Had he done that in a wealthy neighborhood of Baltimore, made eye contact with police and ran, he would have been going for a jog. But that's what triggered the initial interaction. And so you have the arrest. An hour after that, he's in a coma where he has 4 broken vertebrae and a crushed larynx. And it's an important thing to note because, we had this unrest that took place in Baltimore. And people often say the thing that brought the temperature down was when the city went under a state of emergency and the National Guard got brought in. That's not true. In fact, I can give you direct evidence that that was not the case because the protests still continued even after the National Guard was brought in. I'm a very big believer that oftentimes when you dress for conflict happens. But at the end of the week, there was supposed to be the largest protest that Baltimore saw on the Saturday, and it never happened. The reason it never happened wasn't because the National Guard was there for a week. The reason it didn't happen was because at that moment, the state's attorney the Friday before ended up pressing charges against the officers for what happened to Freddie Gray. And now we can fast forward and you look at the fact that 2 of the officers were found not guilty, the four other officers, their charges were dropped. But that was the first time in the history of Baltimore, a city that was under a consent decree for patterns and practices of improper and imbalanced policing on Black communities, that there was ever what people felt was a measure of accountability. And so we have to be able to address the conditions that are existing within communities. We have to be able to address the fact that I believe very deeply that people spend far too much time focusing on what happened in the death of Freddie, which was incredibly important, but we did not spend enough time focusing on what happened with his life. The fact that this was a child who was born premature and underweight and addicted to heroin, and his mother battled addiction for much of her life, and she was living and born into deep poverty, and he was living and born into deep poverty. The fact that he was lead poisoned in the house that he was living in by the time he was 2 years old. So we have to spend time understanding and addressing not just his death, but his life, and why the most heartbreaking thing was maybe the most peaceful week of his life was the week he was in a coma. Because at least that week he was surrounded by doctors and nurses. At least that week the city knew his name. At least that week the city cared whether he lived or died. But we also cannot just stop there and just say it's about fixing poverty. There also has to be accountability for the people who are inside of our communities and the people whose job is to protect and to serve communities, for people to feel that if people shade outside the lines, and again, we're not talking, the vast majority of people, to include members of my own family, are in law enforcement. I served as a paratrooper in the Army for 10 years. But I can tell you right now, if there are people who do shade outside those lines, if the community does not feel there's accountability for them or even the potential for accountability for them. That trust that becomes a basic prerequisite will never be found.
That's such a powerful framing, Wes. Thank you. The idea of focusing on life and not death, that's going to stay with us. One of the things you said about accountability, I think really pulls in a point that started to percolate in the conversation before about how are we holding law enforcement accountable when you do have officer-involved fatalities, you do have police violence, and part of what we've seen in the incredibly effective grassroots organizing and work today is the call to defund or divest or abolish police, which is something that I'd love to pull in some perspectives on. So can we get Mayor Bottoms and Chief Arradondo in, along with Commissioner Outlaw? Because I'd love to get all of your views here. This is the tip of the tongue for every conversation right now on police. What does it mean to defund? What does it mean to divest? What does it mean to abolish? And people define those things differently. But I think it's really important that we hear from all of you who are in law enforcement, in leadership, as a Mayor Bottoms, to be able to define for our viewing audience and help set the stage for a conversation around what that means, regardless of where we fall in this debate. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. And so I think this is a really critical moment for you to be able to shape up for us and put forward to all of us your views on what is the watchword of the policing discussion right now. First, Commissioner Outlaw, if you could.
Sure, and I think that's a pretty important question to ask now, because to your point, we're hearing calls to defund, divest, abolish, and then we hear these terms being used synonymously, and everyone walks away without a shared operational understanding of what's even being said. With that said, we know that if we're talking about defunding the police, meaning pulling away from police departments' budgets and putting into other social services, you know, I've said I'm always a fan, right? Police shouldn't be doing everything. And in fact, we don't want to do everything. We don't want to respond to all of the calls that we're getting. But also at the same time, I don't want you taking my money to put that into something else. And here's why. The majority of our police budgets are around personnel costs, right? So if we're talking about taking funding away from the police department budget, ultimately we're talking about reducing authorized strength, layoffs, and pretty much letting folks go, letting sworn officers go, as we're seeing increases in violent crime. The flip side, or the counter to that argument, would be, well, if we properly utilized those who are responsible for social services in the city, then we wouldn't have the need for so many officers. Is that true? We don't know yet. What's the phased approach? If we start reducing our authorized strengths, what are we going to do in the short term? You can't just say, okay, we started out with 6,500 police officers today, and next fiscal year we're going to give you 1,000 less. Now figure it out. It doesn't work that way. We have to have a phased approach. 1. 2, like with anything, if you want folks who work for you, in service of you, with you, to work at their peak, to work at their best. We value performance here, and we're working to create a performance culture here. What can we do to ensure that everyone, whether sworn or non-sworn, are working at their peak? That means you have to invest. If you want your car to run well, you have to take it to get service. And I'm not being dismissive, right? I'm just using an analogy here, but you have to invest in that, whatever it is. So investment for us is not only maintaining, levels of, sworn officers that we have here, but it's ensuring that we have the proper training, the proper equipment. And the problem with saying, well, you know what, you get a one-time training cost for this year and that year, and it's going to remain the same. We have to be nimble. We have to be quick. We have to adapt as times change. And again, as community expectations change, as technology changes, we have to be able to adapt with this. And I think a very key example of that was here in Philadelphia when the pandemic hit, and the ability to keep up with technology and to now engage with community virtually, as opposed to going out in the traditional way that we've been so used to doing, because we're social beings. But we really have to step back and rethink, how can we engage community and continue to try to build and strengthen our relationships without doing it face to face. That costs money. So, when you take away from our ability to really give you the optimal performance or the service that we need to provide you.
That concept of phasing is so important to the practical policy process, and that's a really great stake in the ground for us in our conversation. Mayor Bottoms, can I come to you for some perspective?
Yes, and if I've had my way, the slogan "defund the police" would have been a very different slogan. It would have been reimagine our police force, because that's essentially what we are asking elected officials and we're asking the community to do. And there is a way to do it. We are doing it in Atlanta. When I came into office, one of the first pieces of legislation I pushed through was to eliminate cash bail bonds in the city of Atlanta, and then followed by our ending our relationship with ICE. So we ended up with a 400,000 plus square foot city detention center that is primarily empty. And it's given us an opportunity to reimagine our corrections department. Do we need them inside of an almost empty city detention center, or do we need them out in the community helping provide services that we can't always provide the personnel, put the personnel towards? That's reimagining public safety. It also gives us an opportunity to look at this facility, work with our community-based partners, and look at how we can transform this into a center of equity, a center of health and wellness, a facility that people can walk into and receive assistance, and it not be this center of mass incarceration. Because just as the narrative was given on Freddie Gray, the first thing that I thought about was impulsivity, and how that's often prevalent with young African American men. And then as the rest of the story unfolded, we know exactly what that's all about. This is why we have to reimagine public safety, so we can reallocate those dollars, so that we can have places and spaces in our communities where people can walk in off the street and not always even know what they don't know, but there's a place that we can redirect them. But when we talk about defunding the police, when I look at our city budget, I see personnel costs, I see workers' compensation. And what I would say is, if I walk into one room and I've got a group of people saying, eliminate your police department, if I walk into the next room, I'll have just as many people saying they want to see more police officers in our communities. But at the end of the day, people just want to be safe, and they want to be safe within their communities, but they also want to be safe when they have interactions with the police department. So I do think it's incumbent upon us to reimagine public safety, and that reimagination may mean reallocating resources and personnel in other areas. But I think at the end of the day, the goal remains for our communities to be safe and for us to be able to have safe interactions with one another.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Mayor. And Chief Arradondo, would love to get your perspective on this, because you had raised this initially earlier, and I think this is going to be a thread that traces through all of our conversations over the next couple of weeks on where we go from here. This is the nuts and bolts of the question: how do we reimagine policing, as the mayor says, but thinking about it from a budget perspective and what that means for day-to-day practice and managing departments of hundreds of employees?
Yeah, so really the conversation and the comments that have been made so far have really hit it straight on. For myself and Commissioner Outlaw, when we report to mayors, so if we're reporting to the Honorable Mayor Bottoms, she has a responsibility to make sure that all of the residents of Atlanta are safe. And so if we start talking about defunding the very same police department that is going to be charged with an aspect of doing that, and we don't have all the data, that's why I agree with Commissioner Outlaw. We have to have a phased-in approach. Here in Minneapolis, I raised the issue of where we were at in terms of staffing. And for the first time ever in our city, we're exploring a real detailed, comprehensive staffing study. You would have thought that in the 153 years of our department, we would have had some form of that, but we have not. But I will also say too, and I think this goes to Commissioner Outlaw's point too, reform costs, changing culture, that there's a cost to that. And at the same time, we have to look at reimagining, as the Honorable Mayor mentioned, we have to look at reimagining what policing looks like. The one thing that I do know that communities will continue, what spectrum they're on, whether it's defunding, abolish, or dismantling, we judge others by their actions. We judge ourselves by our intentions. And we know the saying, the road to hell. So people are going to ultimately judge us by our actions and our budgets. Again, that budget tells our story. But I do believe that, as Commissioner Outlaw mentioned too, we have to do that in a phased approach. We don't want to do anything very quick, very short-sighted that ends up harming the very same communities that we're out there to be guardians for and look after.
Actions versus intention. That's such a challenging dialect. I appreciate that. Thanks so much, Chief. DeAnna, I want to bring you in here on the divest, defund, abolish debate. You've worked at the highest levels of leadership and advocacy in the federal government. Give us your perspective from where you sit and how you see the debate unfolding.
So I love the fact that when we first got on here, we knew we all was going to have different perspectives based on the different seats that we come in. We only can address this issue from the seat we come in. But I'll be honest, you can't reform something. Reforming means fixing something that was working right at one time. So you can't reform something that was never working right. That means you actually have to rebuild or build what it is you want. When the mayor talked about reimagining, it's being bold. But when we talk about divest, invest, when we talk about reducing the budget of police, all we're talking about on the bottom line, I think, is when it said mission alignment, is building communities. We're asking for our communities to have the resources that are necessary for us to thrive. There's no reason a person with myself, having been incarcerated, having been impacted by the system, having worked in certain elements, working for commissioners, working for governors, working in the Department of Justice, and running a national organization, that even I still run into barriers of accessing adequate housing based on a 20-year criminal record. There's no reason that our schools in the most impoverished area, and I love the fact that Wes said there is no school to prison pipeline, there is a poverty to prison pipeline. There is no reason our schools in the most impoverished area have more school officers with guns than we do social workers to address the trauma that is happening in our community. And one of the things that I like to say all the time is, in the Black community, when there is a homicide or a victim of a violence, our kids get a memorial on the closest street sign with teddy bears and a t-shirt, and they go to school. But a kid can commit suicide in a Caucasian community. That Monday morning, that school has grief counselors on deck to say that that is not a normal behavior. So we have normalized violence in certain communities from the people that other communities are saying they want to feel safe from. But those inner city communities, those impoverished communities, have not been safe themselves because of what we have normalized as being okay. So when we talk about divesting, we're not saying take 65 officers and get rid of 1,000, but 1,000 of them can act in social worker capacities with the degrees that they had when they went through a college like John Jay to become public servants. So we have to talk about how we utilize is not always shifting and deducting, but it can be shifting in a different capacity to have the outreach. There are definitely the mayor I've seen in Atlanta actually doing huge engagement on community. You have to remember when Wes talked about Freddie Gray looked at the officer and ran, what's a crime in one community is not a crime in another community. Why is it that when African Americans interact with law enforcement, there's an instant anxiety attack of this is not going to go well for me, right? That's a historical interaction of what law enforcement represents in our communities, and those are some of the trajectories that we have to start navigating from. And I think the mayor talked about it. I think the most traumatized that I see when I talk to men who may have committed a violent act, serving extensive sentences, and you start to have a real conversation, and they go back to their childhood. And they go back to that night when the police kicked in their door on Christmas Eve and snatched their parent. and they're crying and they say, where are you taking my parent? And they say they'll be back, but their parent doesn't come back for 20 years. The distrust was broke because you took the most vital person in their life and actually stripped them. So they always we see in our communities, the police are always removed. We've never seen the police add to in our communities. And I think that's how we have to start looking at this. How do we build community relationships? But also, how do we start being a resource that we're building thriving communities that are less reliant on law enforcement interaction?
That's fantastic. Rebuilding communities as an umbrella for reimagining public safety and reimagining policing. That's such an important point. That gets me to the next segment of this that I really want to dig into. And I want to bring Sean in here on what does success look like, especially given what we just heard from Mayor Bottoms and Chief Arradondo and DeAnna. When we're thinking about policing practices and we're thinking about where we go from here, we need to figure out what are some metrics of success. And this is what we want to untangle and unpack over the course of these next conversations. But would love if you could give us some sense of how you see a framework for defining success.
Well, thanks. I've talked about this publicly a number of times, and I think it's really a twofold issue. One is messaging. And when I say messaging, I mean messaging to officers what their role is. Majority of officers that are working today, from the time they were hired, they were defined and casted as warriors. They were told they were to be warriors in the war on crime. They were soldiers in the war on drugs, the war on poverty. And to some degree now, I think the war on violence, and by casting them in this way, I think that officers now are really confused about what their role is, and frankly, I think a lot of them are willing to play an active role in working with communities to build and co-produce public safety, but the messaging that they're getting is very conflicted, and that leads to defining what success looks like, because it's easy to measure things like arrests, the number of arrests, or the number of crimes that occur in a certain area, or the certain types of crimes. It's a lot harder to assess whether people in a neighborhood feel safe, and how to determine whether or not they're comfortable with their kids walking across the street and going to the park. And my concern is that, I think when we talk about public safety, a lot of focus goes on the police, and I'm not trying to detract from that focus at all. Because the police have a crucial role to play, and they should be accountable for what they do in that role. But also, we can't just, even if you could fix just the police, that doesn't create public safety. That doesn't do things like create access to people for food or medical care or mental health care. It doesn't address the trauma issues. And so I think, when we talk about success, and we talk about success, what does public safety look like? We need to be able to figure out a way to message to officers what role we really want them to play, and how they can be guardians of people's rights, how they can help people to achieve that feeling of security and secure in the feeling that they can go about their daily lives and take care of their kids, and that their kids can play safely in the front yard, and that they can get the medical care that they need and have access to a grocery store in their neighborhood, et cetera. And to the extent that police can be an active participant in playing that role, I think they're ready.
That's a really important point. When it comes to defining success, I think this gets back to Erica's point about co-production of public safety. Can we bring Erica in here? Would love to get your perspective, Erica, on what Sean just said and how you would think about defining for our viewing audience, and as we think about pushing into this policy space that has been ripe with conversation for decades, what success should look like in a vision of a new public safety.
Yeah, and so I think that everyone should have access to a quality of life, right? Everyone should have access to not living in a space of fear, right? Because when we go outside, we are fearful that we're going to have crime acted against us, or the police is going to act against us. And so that mindset, and free from the trauma, free, as he said, with the ability to just have to grow and build generational wealth and be free from those things. And as Wes talked about, the lineages of poverty that keep us at a space where we can't have access to quality life, you know? And so those things shifting, because as he talked about, changing the mindset and the system of the police department is not going to give us access to ending racism and poverty and discrimination and the lack of resources in our community to allow us to live in a space of happiness. And so success is the, when we talk about reinvestment, we have to invest, as Wes Moore was talking about, and hopefully he'll be cutting that $5 million check to us so that we can do some phenomenal work out here, but investing in the people on the ground, so that the quality of life that we are experiencing on a day-to-day basis shifts, and those things that lead to us being unsafe will begin to shift one by one as we even the playing field and change the mindset of those who come into our community to, quote, help us keep peace or serve the community and protect property and so on and so forth. And so I think it is the shifting of the dynamics of how we show up on a day-to-day basis without the access to a quality of life.
That's a perfect segue. Can we bring Wes in to comment? As Erica mentioned, the Robin Hood Foundation is focused on poverty. More of your.
I thought you was going to have him comment on the $5 million.
That's coming. That's coming.
We want to get your perspective, Wes, on how do we define success when we're thinking about public safety, especially through that lens of the poverty that we know is a through line for all of the challenges that we're taking on, and especially what we see for Black and brown communities when it comes to policing.
Yeah. You know, it is interesting because I think it's important for us to distinguish between what we mean by tactics and what we mean by strategy and what we mean by goals. You know, there are things that we just have to be able to do. And again, I feel like a broken record where I say amen to what, you know, Erica was talking about how we have to, you know, really talk about really lifting up and building up, building up communities. You know, we have to be able to think really long and hard about the laws that we do have on place, you know, and how they are unequally proportioned and how they're unequally distributed. I mean, the fact is we need to have a very serious conversation in this country about things like the Law Enforcement Order Bill of Rights. We need to have a very serious conversation about everything from police disciplinary measures to and record release to chokehold bans, to the fact that you know that racial profiling will only become illegal once a governor signs it into law, banning the process. I.e., we still have states that still have that on books, that racial profiling isn't banned. Mm-hmm. So we have to be able to be honest about the thing that there really needs to be essentially an intellectual audit. Mm-hmm. About the way our society functions and the way our society is structured. The other thing, though, when we're talking about what is the goal that we're actually trying to accomplish with all this, where, you know, I think about it in the case of philanthropy. I think about the case of Robin. I think about the case of my work, where you know, our job, and I look at my job isn't to make organizations bigger, mm-hmm. right? Our job is to make problems smaller. Mm-hmm. Right. Our job is not to, you know, our job is to not make ourselves bigger. Mm-hmm. Our job is to make the problem of poverty smaller. And so when we're talking about this, when we say, what then becomes the goal? The goal for me is actually, pretty simple. It's if we have communities, and going back to our initial point, who feel that level of safety, freedom, autonomy, and how we have to then take every single measure to be able to help secure that. That includes everything from what are the food and the food and the options that people have inside their communities. What schools are our children attending, and what are they learning inside of those institutions? What about the housing and the fact that even take the state of Maryland as one example, we still have hundreds of thousands of children who are lead poisoned right now. We've known that lead is a neurotoxin for a century in this country. We've just been amazingly color and class coded in the way we've dealt with it. And also, how do we think about the measures of policing? If we can deal with all of these things simultaneously, as everybody has said, as the mayor has not only said, but frankly, how the mayor has shown in Atlanta, if we can do these things simultaneously, this is not about how do we right size a police force or how do we right size this. This is about, are we making the problem smaller? Because the truth is that if there's a reduction of a police force, but that's because there's just not a need anymore. In my opinion, that's a good day. But a right sizing of any when you're talking about force alignment, force structures, it then has to come to what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And are we then thinking about all the various elements that we have to try to solve the problem that we're all devoting our lives to trying to fix?
Tactics versus strategy versus goals. I think that's a great framing for what we need to unpack in order to be able to get our arms around all of these issues. I appreciate that very much, Wes. And the idea of making problems smaller is another one that's gonna stick with us. I'd like to bring Mayor Bottoms in to tie all of this together. Mayor Bottoms, if you're there, you're the chief executive of a city of 500,000 people, a 1,700 person strong police force. How do you think about this and this line of dialogue, which I think really will be the platform for the rest of our discussions on public safety and the path to the future, is being able to meld the philosophical and the values-based conversation we're having with the practicalities of running a city and running a police department?
There's so many layers to this, and I know that you all know that, and it often seems overwhelming to try and connect them all, but we got to keep trying to get it right. And when I look at our police department, when I'm looking at stats showing me that roughly 22%, only 22% of our police officers live in the city of Atlanta, that says that I have a disconnect with our community, because I have officers who aren't invested in the city. They're coming in to do a job and then they're leaving, which also means that quite often our officers aren't even familiar or know the dynamics of the communities that they are policing. So while I'm addressing public safety, I've also got to address our affordable housing issue that we have in the city. When I look at our police force and I'm told that our officers our officers of color aren't getting past a certain rank because they're having challenges passing the exams, then what that tells me is that we're not meeting our officers where they are in terms of how we are administering our exams. That means that somebody is not thinking about how African American men often learn differently. It doesn't just end in grade school, it doesn't end in high school, that continues throughout life. So that tells me we've got to reimagine how we even promote officers in our city. And at the end of the day, we want to be safe. We want our families to be safe. We want our communities to be safe. We want our officers to be able to go home to their families healthy and whole. And I want my children and my sons to have an interaction with our police officers where they come home to me healthy and whole. And so at the end of the day, when we talk about public safety, we've got to talk about all of these pieces simultaneously, because otherwise we're just putting Band-Aids on gaping wounds. And unfortunately, we saw the worst of it in the city of Atlanta this past summer when we saw the interaction with Rayshard Brooks, and that could have ended in so many different ways, but it didn't. And it is something that we are challenged with in Atlanta, and I know that communities across this country are facing these same challenges. But at the end of the day, there is a will to get it right. And when I hear from our police officers, I'm hearing everything from anger to just downright confusion on what is it they should do. They go out doing the best they can do, trying to make sure that they're doing their job the right way. And then it ends up not the way that anybody wants it to. And they're made out to be monsters as a force as a whole. So there's healing that has to happen, but there's still work that has to be done. And as we are reimagining our policies in the city and reforming many of our policies, not only do we have buy-in from many of our progressive leaders, but we also have buy-in from our communities. We sent out a citywide survey to get input from the people in Atlanta, but we also have buy-in from our police officers as well. How do you want to see things done differently? Because what I've recognized in Atlanta, many of my officers are African-American men. So when they take off that uniform, they are subject to many of the same challenges that we're dealing with within our police department and our communities. And so it at times feels like it is this Herculean task that we have before us, but doing hard things is often hard to do. But I know that because we have the will of the country and we're having this collective conversation in a way we've never had before, I know that we're going to be better because of it as a city and as a country as a whole.
Hard things are hard. Words to live by, especially when we're talking about the complexity of this challenge. When we think about public safety, I really appreciate that, Madam Mayor. I want to bring in Commissioner Outlaw and DeAnna to talk a little bit about where we go from here. And ultimately, I think we want to get perspective from everybody on this, but we want to be able to move not just into a visioning exercise, but from the visioning that we're doing now that has been ongoing for many years and thinking about how we meet community needs in terms of public safety, but taking those practical steps. DeAnna, can you give us some thoughts on how we take practical and affirmative strides forward from this moment of reckoning, which has so much potential, but I, like many, feel we might squander if we don't get it right.
Right. And I think we're in a prime opportunity to actually try to really get it right. Mm-hmm. And part of that is when all the uprisings started and we were talking about communities wanting to be heard, communities have demand. At Just Leadership, we realized because of our Close Rikers campaign, we were one of the only organizations in the country in New York City who had actually had a plan that was truly from the community's voices called Build Communities. While we were talking about closing a correctional facility, we immediately established a plan, and our leaders who have been impacted by Rikers, what they needed to see in their community, what were the resources they needed to see. So one of the things to get it right, we have to have authentic conversations like this. But we have to have authentic conversations in the communities most impacted by the harms that we are trying to repair at this time. Mm-hmm. If we don't have that authentic conversation, we are there again making decisions for a people in a marginalized, oppressed state of what we think they need without truly asking them. And I've even went a little deeper in New York saying, we have a Build Communities plan that says this is what we should do with the cost savings from law enforcement to the communities. But let's go further, because what the Bronx need is totally different than what Brooklyn needs. And if we don't identify and let that community's voice be heard to reduce their gun violence, to reduce their reliance on gangs, we're going to actually miss the mark again, knowing that the Bronx has been hit harder by mass incarceration, been hit harder by underinvestments in their community, hit harder by lack of resources around substance abuse, mental health, inadequate educational institutions, inadequate health care. There is no way in 2020 we should still have lead poisoning happening because of inadequate housing and where people have to live just to be able to afford to have a place to stay when shelter is a basic human need. But in those communities such as the Bronx, it is still a reality, but it is not a reality in Brooklyn. So those needs of those barrels are going to be very different. And we must engage the communities most marginalized. We must engage the people most oppressed to have a voice in what their safety looks like. We cannot keep determining it for ourselves based on our experience.
Right. DeAnna, let me stick with you for just a second because I think this is such an important point. When it comes to the concept of having an authentic conversation and engagement with community, can you give us a very brief taste of what that means? Because I think we hear that a lot, and I think there are a lot of well-intentioned folks who want to have those conversations, but how you do it is something that I think remains a mystery for a lot of folks who actually want to be a part of the co-production of public safety, who want to be a part of authentically engaging impacted communities, but don't yet know how.
Right. So, and I think one of the things, this is where when Erica talked about that co-production, there's a ability and a skill set that individuals such as Erica's organization and Just Leadership have that the police department and the mayor can't do, right? They can't actually go into a community and say, we want to have an authentic conversation, and individuals who have been impacted by the system or individuals who have been harmed come into a room. But Just Leadership and Erica Ford's organization can do that, right? So that's when we start talking about the co-production. The problem is organizations such as the ones me and Erica run aren't well funded to do that. And again, I think the chief said it about your budget determines your priorities. If your budget had allocation just even from asset forfeiture money that should go back into the community that money came out of, to organizations like Just Leadership or Erica's to actually do exactly what we're talking about. So again, it's not asking you to do anything new. We're actually asking you to do what was well intended based on the resources that are already there. And that's one of the rules. If asset forfeiture money comes out of that community from drug trafficking, drug engagement, you should turn around and put it back into that same community in a positive way of funding some of those grassroots organizations that have the ability to convene those individuals and change the trajectory and work with them in a different way that you could not. And again, that's different because that's asking a city administration, a state administration, the police, that's asking them to rely on individuals that traditionally have actually been outlawed because we've been convicted of a crime. We've had interactions with law enforcement. This is when you talk about reimagining who your allies are. You know, we always say we don't need allies, we need accomplices in this work. This is actually saying, you know what? They have a superpower to convene a population that is most harmed, a population that has been subject to what we call public safety. How do we fund them to properly go in and work with those communities in the Bronx, in Manhattan? How do we have them work with those communities? But again, we have to be well funded, just like everyone else well funds the national organizations. And actually being women of color, that actually plays a role against us as well, because we are known to get 1% of philanthropy dollars in this country.
I am married to a Black woman founder, and she knows that intimately, despite being a successful fundraiser. But one of the things that you just said, and what I really want to emphasize, is the idea that community engagement is not something that anybody can just do. It's an expertise and a set of skills, and it should be funded and treated and respected as such. So thank you for giving us that perspective. We are going to run out of time in the next 4 minutes. So I want to actually do a round robin lightning round, a quick question just to close us out. This has been a fantastic conversation so far, but to get perspective from everybody, very briefly in 30 seconds apiece, if there were 3 things that you'd want to see happen immediately for us to take steps towards a reimagined public safety, what would those 3 things be? And I'm going to start with Commissioner Outlaw.
Great, really quick, 3 things. I would say support and investment. A lot of folks, want to know, officers want to know, are you in support of us, or are you trying to tear us down? This is like a relationship, right? So if all we hear is negative, negative, negative without any positive feedback, we're going to think that we don't do anything right. So I would say support is important. Not just of all police, but of those who are in leadership that are actually trying to move forward to transform and do the work. The second thing would be exactly what Sean said, a shared understanding of what success is. And I would say the third thing is accountability. So holding us accountable and actually showing support of us. They're not mutually exclusive. We can do both. You don't have to choose.
Fantastic. Thank you, Commissioner. Let's go to Sean.
Well, so three things I would say is, one, we should require training for all officers from the academy including in-service training on cultural competency, including the role of police historically in the United States, because I don't think it's well covered, and I don't think it's well understood, and that would give officers the right framing and perspective. I also think we should have body cameras on all officers, and they should be activated anytime they're interacting with a member of the public. That's an accountability piece, and it's not just for the officers, it's for everyone who's involved. And finally, I'd like to see officers have access to more resources in terms of being able to make referrals for folks, connect them with services to deal with issues related to poverty, addiction, and mental health, because those are the key issues that lead to our interactions with them.
Fantastic. Chief Arradondo.
I would say support and empowerment for our children and our young people, housing, and I'd also say accountability. We have to hold ourselves accountable to our peers and to our community.
Fantastic. Erica.
I would say to invest resources in the type of work that we do in New York City with the New York City Crisis Management System and expand it across the nation. I would say to hold police accountable when they use their power to institute aggression and trauma on communities. And I would say to get rid of police who are racist and carry out racist acts in community.
Thank you. DeAnna.
Accountability for sure, accountability of actions. But I also think just as police have access to our background when they stop us, we should have access to the police that are in our communities' backgrounds as well. Actually, an investment in our communities. And something that I think no matter what we do, even if you ban chokeholds and someone ends up dying, we have to take a look at this qualified immunity for police officers if we're ever going to have people actually stop and think before they act.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And finally, Mayor Bottoms, if you would.
Programmatic investment in our communities, also investment in public safety, making sure that our officers have what they need, access to emotional health services and all of the things that they need to make sure that they get home to their families safe and whole as well. And then sensible gun control and background checks for those seeking to buy weapons, and also for our officers who are empowered to use those weapons. I think it's important that we invest in public safety, because we want to make sure that the people who are charged with being guardians in our communities, that we aren't picking people who didn't have any other choice for a job, that we're picking the best that there is available. And I think it's important for us to make that same investment in our communities in a tangible way as well.
Thank you so much. We are almost exactly at time. I just want to say thank you to each of our distinguished guests for this conversation. Exactly what we were hoping for in terms of a framing conversation for a series of discussions that John J. and Noble are going to be hosting over the course of the next month. I get to be the lucky one to engage with all of the experts and ask some of these questions and hear from you all. But it's incredibly important that we also receive input from all of our listening public. So anybody out there, we've had a lively conversation in the comments as you watch this video. Please, we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you want to hear from the experts. This has been a really important and powerful set of reflections on the ecosystem of reform and the ecosystem of public safety, making sure that we're contextualizing what policing actually means to our communities and in our communities. That's the through line of what I've heard from all of our guests today. So I want to say a deep thanks to Wes Moore, to Mayor Bottoms, to Sean Smoot, to Chief Arradondo, Commissioner Outlaw, to Ms. Hoskins and Ms. Ford for all of their contributions today, and look forward to the next conversation with you all. Thanks so much.